Hello, welcome to Disconnected and for listening to my rants. So this is one of those Cambridge debates. I never knew about this guy until I fell onto this video. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Will Cambridge students hate historians' facts? So this is one of those debate things from the Cambridge Union. Cambridge University students at the Cambridge Union didn't like hearing historian and broadcaster Rafe Heydel-Mankoo argue anybody with a double surname is just always seems like a bit of a fud to me. A bit of a pretentious fad. Argue that Britain should not pay reparations for slavery and colonialism. Well-established facts about the British Empire, Asia and Africa, which were well known to earlier generations of students, seem to be completely new to many of them, and some do not want to hear or believe anything that contradicts the narrative they've been taught. So I don't think this is what's happening here. So let's go through this.
Institutions, the monarchy and the Commonwealth realms. From the BBC to ABC, Rafe is a well-known commentator in national and international media. He is a trustee of the Royal Canadian Heritage Trust and a senior fellow at the New Cultural Forum think tank.
Blah.
Rafe, the floor is yours.
Blah.
Right. Round two. I've been on the winning side of every debate apart from one at the University of East Sussex over the years, but I somehow suspect that this may not be following along those previous lines, but let's see how we go here. It's a great pleasure to be invited back to this august chamber and to see such a full house and a very enthusiastic, if not energetic crowd here today. It's been 7 years since I was last here, and university campuses and this chamber were rather quieter in those days, and undoubtedly one of the factors that's contributed to this increased passion is the emotion that envelops topics like colonialism and empire, and I say this also as a child of empire. But, in recent months, we've seen the issue of slavery and colonialism expand beyond campuses, as we've now got, of course, from Barbados to Jamaica, prominent Caribbeans also calling for Britain to pay reparations for slavery and the consequences of colonialism. And, Madam Speaker, were we engaged in this debate in 1807 or 1833, I likely would have crossed the floor to support the motion opposite, because, of course, the victims of the horrendous horrors of slavery would have been alive and deserving of damages. But it's not 1807, it's not 1907, it's not even 2007. Over 2 centuries have passed since Britain led the world as the first empire in history to abolish slavery, and the right of reparations died long ago, because reparations are fundamentally about matters of tort law. The purposes of damages, restoration of reparation, is to restore the victim, the slave, to the position they were in before the damage occurred, slavery. The actual victim only can receive damages, not their descendants. And therein lies the rub, because some 6 or 7 generations separate those alive today from their British Empire slave ancestors.
I love that argument because it comes up all the time. Well, I wasn't a slave owner, so why should I pay it? He says that the reparations is only there to put the person affected directly back to a position where he was beforehand. Now, the problem with that statement is very simple. The groups that have been affected by slavery and the countries that have been affected by slavery to this day still live with the effects of what happened 200 years ago, or up to 200 years ago. They still have a country that is kind of, from a wealth point of view, white dominated. A lot of their industries are still, dare I say, even British owned or white owned, and the people themselves, although they might have a better, from a Western point, perceived better life because they have modern amenities, they still live with the effects of slavery. But more importantly, the families that ran, for example, slave-run farms, their wealth is extreme to this day. If you look at all the landowners here, all the lords and all the rich folk here, with their massive mansions, that was all built on the profits of slavery. And their families and their descendants of the slave owners are filthy rich, in politics, fingers in all the businesses. And then you compare that to the people of the likes of Barbados, you would understand why they would want reparations.
Whilst not just yet, thank you so much. Whilst it's undeniable that 19th century slaves suffered...
So he keeps stopping people from interrupting, and I think he does it very clearly, because nearly every single point he makes where somebody wants to interrupt him, his argument fails logically.
Unspeakable horrors, in what way can this lead one to conclude that their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are also victims and deserving of reparations too? On the contrary, from Britain to the Caribbean, the descendants of slaves today have a far better and higher quality of life than they would have had their ancestors remained in Africa.
According to our Western standards.
And that's an indisputable fact. Well, if you let me carry on, I'll tell you why. Well, first I ask you, is a current descendant of a slave ethically entitled to benefit from their ancestors' sufferings? And who should pay? Is it ethical for an innocent person today to be culpable for the sins of their forefathers? Now, CARICOM, which is the Caribbean body calling for reparations, wants British taxpayers to pay. But why?
Yeah, no. The British taxpayer, I wouldn't say, is the one who needs to pay here. We've got about... we had about 3,000 slave owners up into the late 1800s. Now, you've got to remember what happened when the British abolished slavery. They didn't go, all right, slaves, you're free. Here's all the money that you lost, and here's a whole bunch of money for your suffering at the hands of our people. No, what they did was they let the slaves go. The slaves tended to be then employed by those people for pittance, and the slave owners were then given money by the government as a kind of payback for the loss of their slaves. So essentially, the taxpayer already paid for the release of the slaves, but the slaves didn't get anything. It was the landowners who lost the slaves, that were reimbursed for their losses. And no, they are enough filthy rich descendants of slave owners, and between them they will have more than enough money, I'm sure, for the reparations. Now, nobody is blaming the great-great-great-grandchildren of the slave owners that they were horrible people, but they are the ones who benefit to this day from their great-great-great-granddaddy's horrors.
Out of a population of millions, there were only 3,000 slave owners in Britain. The vast majority of the population of Britain descend from people whose lives were one of abject poverty and hardship, working in hellish conditions akin to serfdom. Why should they, as taxpayers, pay reparations? It's not just yet. Thank you so much.
Even more reasons why the rich folk, especially of Britain, of the legacy of slavery and colonialism, are the ones who need to make shit right.
So much. 16% of the British population is now also foreign-born, so why should they pay for reparations? What about the descendants of slaves living in Britain today? Why should people from Trinidad and Tobago living here pay reparations to people in Jamaica? Then again, why is the demand for reparations always focused and framed in terms of Britain? Why are no activists asking for reparations from the African states that were equally complicit in slavery? Should they not pay reparations? They provided the slaves that were transferred over the ocean, and millions more slaves were kept in slavery in Africa by other Africans, just as were being transported across the Atlantic. Why does nobody ever actually speak about that unpleasant truth? What about the Arabs and the Muslims who bought and sold African slaves for centuries before the British arrived and continued to do so into the 20th century until the British...
So this is one of those deflection things, isn't it? Like, the reason we're not talking about that is because we're currently talking about the British colonial slaves and the reparations that are demanded from Britain and its slave and colonial legacy. That's why we're not talking about it. We all know that slavery existed all over the place, and some were even worse. And obviously, we clap with one hand that thank you very much, Britain, for getting rid of slavery. But if you really look at the history, slavery was kind of stopped, but Britain and the Britain's rich still treated everybody like absolute dogs. That cannot be denied. Even their own people in Britain, in the factories, in the cotton mills, in the mines, the list goes on and on and on and on. So this idea that, oh, look, Britain got rid of slavery, they just kind of changed it to another kind of way of getting cheap labor. I mean, obviously it was a big deal, but they still treated people like shit afterwards. But anyway, the point is, don't deflect it to others who did the bad thing. We are now talking about Britain and its legacy.
The French tried to stop it. And indeed, what about the slavery that carries on today? The International Labour Organization says that currently approximately 7 in every 1,000 Africans is a slave. 10 million people. In 2017, CNN...
See, that's what I mean. It's just deflections. Like, yeah, we know that, and obviously, and there are people trying to do something about it. But let's stick to the conversation here, which is some countries want reparations from Britain because of Britain's misdoings. You know, whatever the Arabs did or whatever certain countries in Africa did, that is another topic. And it also needs to be dealt with, but we're talking about Britain now, so don't try and deflect and say, well, look, don't come to me because there's this other person also did something nasty.
Reported hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. So much energy is given to historic reparation and the historic plight of slaves. I would have more time for the argument if the people actively pursuing that course of action were equally vocal about surely the far more horrendous plights of slaves today, where there are more slaves today in bondage, in slavery, than crossed over the Atlantic. So where are the protests outside the Nigerian High Commission? Where are the protests outside the embassies of Niger, which has 800,000 slaves today? What about Mali and Chad and Sudan and Cameroon? It's almost as if there's an ulterior motivation behind...
There's no ulterior motive. Obviously something has to be done about it. Nobody's disagreeing with that, but we're talking about Britain.
The call for apologies and reparations exclusively from Britain. And how far should we... No, I would love to, and normally I would, maybe a bit later on, but I'm getting into the swing of things now. And how far should we take this? Should Britain seek reparations for the Barbary slaves? 1 million Europeans, at the same time as Africans were going over the Atlantic, 1 million Europeans were enslaved by the Ottoman states of Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia. And
yeah, then go and ask them for reparations. I mean, this is not the topic at hand. Nobody's disputing any of this.
They carried on after the abolition.
But don't
of the
use
slave
this
trade
as
by
some
the
sort of
British.
sidestep.
Should Britain demand reparations from North Africa? Of course not. It's time to move on, and so should we.
Let's not forget North
But
Africa
let's turn
is
away
dirt
from
poor. There's
slavery
nothing
and
to get from
expand
them
our view
anyway.
to colonialism more broadly. What disadvantage has colonialism actually caused to those living in the former British colonies of the Caribbean? And disadvantage compared to whom? And this is to go back to the point that you asked. Most of the former colonies of the Caribbean are now successful middle-income countries. The GDP per head of the Bahamas is higher than Portugal and is comparable to Spain and Italy. You never hear that.
Okay, here's the problem with that statement. A lot of those places now have super rich putting their domicile there. Mainly kind of non-doms from the UK. which means that you have a shitload of poor people and very few massively rich people, which then brings this kind of standard income, this GDP, up. But that does not mean that the people from that place are any better off. It means that a very small minority of people that live there with tons of money bring up that average. So this is taking a statistic and using it in your favor, when actually the statistic does not show the actual truth there. This is an absolute lie.
Do you? Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and other former British slave colonies have higher rankings on the UN's Human Development Index than Brazil, Mexico, or many other Spanish-speaking South American countries.
Again, it is very simple, because if it's like Africa is being seen to have this massive revival at the moment and growth spurt. But if you think about this logically, it is very simple why that's happening. It is because they come from nothing. So every advancement they make is a huge percentage advantage. So if you've got a modern developed country and it's making, some progress, the progress can be measured in 1, 2, 3%. But if a country that has absolutely fuck all makes advances in its economy and its GDP, it is these, from a percentage point of view, it's these massive leaps. So this is so disingenuous to use this as to try and make out as if their lives are so much better thanks to, Britain's involvement.
How has the British Empire disadvantaged the Caribbean nations? It's not clear to me. But let's test this further, and let's go and look and compare the nations of the Caribbean with modern West Africa, the original homelands of Caribbean slaves, to see what life is like there. GDP per capita in Benin is $1,430. In Barbados, it's $17,000, over 10 times higher.
Oh my God. Okay, so again, goes back to GDP doesn't really mean anything, or this average kind of wealth of people, because it is completely obscured if you have a massive difference between rich and poor in that country, right? The other problem is that if you start using West African countries and showing, in this comparison that he's making, those countries are dirt poor and riddled with problems, and most of those problems are a legacy of colonialism, for God's sake.
Life expectancy in Benin is 62, in Barbados it is 79. Rather than writing checks to well-off areas of the world, why not focus on countries and areas that are actually impoverished and require aid? Financial aid not attached to alleged attempts to cleanse one's soul. It can't be clearer. While slavery was abhorrent for those who were enslaved, had they stayed in Africa, the lives of their descendants today would be unquestionably worse.
That is such a ridiculous statement to make. That is like trying to make some sort of prediction about what they would have been like had we not been there. He doesn't know what state those countries would be in if they had no colonial influence. We have no idea what kind of country they would be today, what the quality of life of the people would have been if they were not colonized. It is insane. It is so infuriating that I hope nobody takes this seriously. I mean, just making this I don't even know how to phrase this, because it is so ludicrous to say, well, hold on, look how terrible they are now, when most of those countries actually have warlords and redrawn maps and problems within their society of different factions. And that's one of the reasons, well, there's a lot of reasons why Africa is poor. One is from the effects of colonialism, how colonialism pitted people against each other, the classic British divide and conquer, right? How most of the countries in Africa were colonized by Germany, Belgium, France, Britain, you name it, right? So they were completely disjointed, and they even redrew border lines, and they they drew lines between different factions in different countries. They created this mess in Africa. The other reason is that most of the wealth of Africa has been taken by Western countries. Bananas, cocoa, coffee, you name it. All the things that Africa could have used to really make themselves I'm going to say rich, minerals, you name it, all of that is being taken by the West, and the countries get hardly anything, like oil, in Nigeria and its oil. You name it, the list goes on and on and on. The majority of the massive companies that strip Africa of its resources are not owned by Africans. That means the money disappears from Africa, and the people that work for those companies in those countries are getting really low wages. This is, like, everything he says is bullshit.
So what exactly, actually, is Britain being asked to pay reparations for? Because Britain wasn't the first empire in Africa, in India, in the Americas, but it was the most benign, and the benefits from it far exceed those, for example, of the Islamic and Indian empires that carved
This
out
is
India,
that deflection
of
again.
the Ashanti
This is
Empire,
uninteresting and
of
not
the
part
Holy
of the
Kingdom,
question.
and all of the hundreds and thousands of slaves that were ritually sacrificed every year in Benin. And the Benin bronzes were mentioned. The Benin bronzes commemorates those who actually owned slaves. So whilst on the one hand I can understand why you would protest Coulston's statue, why is there a celebration of the Benin bronzes when they also commemorate slave owners? So why are we apologising for Britain? Are we apologising to Britain for introducing nutrition and food storage policies that led to a decline in the subcontinent's processes of famine that happened every 40 years? In India there was a famine. The population of India soared from 170 million to 450 million over the course of the Raj because of medicine, health, and accurate and proper nutritional standards and food storage compared to how it had been. There had never been in history of India such a surge in population growth. And let's not forget also what Britain did for women's rights, because I think it's fair to say that it's thanks to the British Empire that we have had the progression of women in Africa and India through society. Because, of course, India's history is one of female oppression. It was the British who abolished sutti, the burning of widows on the funeral pyre of their husbands. It was the British that stopped the infanticide of young girls. And it was the British who allowed Hindu widows to remarry. I'm sorry if you don't like the facts, but facts are actually facts. Universities were brought into Africa and India by the British. It's quite... There will be no system of democratic legislatures within these regions.
We don't know that. Many
As Steven Pinker
passed.
has written, pre-state societies before the British Empire arrived were on average far more violent than even the most brutal of modern states. So whilst many wrongs were committed in the 19th and 20th centuries, the modern success of Britain's former colonies today in the 21st century is due in large part to their colonial inheritance. The English language and the common law that enabled them to become global players, their civic institutions, the police, the military, the civil service, the judiciary, parliament, universities, every region of the world you go to, British colonies are the ones most likely to be the most developed, the wealthiest, and the most democratic. I therefore have no opposition in opposing tonight's motion, but I'd like to end by quoting the great black civil rights activist and socialist Bayard Rustin, a friend of Martin Luther King Jr.'s and posthumous recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama, who said, "If my great-grandfather picked cotton for 50 years, then he may deserve some money. But he's dead and gone, and nobody owes me anything." Thank you.
So the problem here is very simple. In between all of that, there's a huge amount of truths, obviously, no doubt about it. However, some of them are not relevant to the subject. Some of them are used in a disingenuous way, and it takes away from the truth at hand, which is Britain is the one who had the most to gain here. And there was a massive amount of suffering under their colonies. And there was a few people who made a shit ton of money from it. So reparations about equalization. And I really don't see the issue here. You could argue that the taxpayer is also, in a way, responsible. Not responsible, but Britain itself has benefited so much. So you could make the argument that it comes from the government. But I think it should come straight from those legacy 3,000 families who many of them still sit on massive estates and have a massive amount of money. And ironically, a lot of them are non-dom, so they don't have to pay tax in this country. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. Comments below. Thank you very much.